It's a pleasure to have you with us as we have this pleasure every Tuesday morning and actually Tuesday afternoon for Sarah right now, who's presenting with us out of London. I'm happy to have you with us today. As I was mentioning, we're actually tackling a very important topic, which is following the release this week of the new Tailings Governance Framework from the ICMM. So today I wanted to invite two of my favorite guests, so Norman Gridley and obviously Sarah Gordon, who is officially the first person I'm inviting twice. So she arrived to the upgrade level of the second level of guests and experts that we bring on the show. As you know, we're big fans of Satarla. They work on the mining engineering risks. So a lot of collaboration that we have potentially ongoing today and potentially in the future. Today, we're going to be therefore talking about mine tailing management. Since it's a slightly more technical presentation and discussion, we're going to have some slides specifically addressing this issue. Those slides will actually be available on our LinkedIn group, and I assume that Julie or Andreas are going to be sending very soon on the chat how to connect there. You also have some QR codes as you see on this presentation. Feel free to look at this. We also put this on this presentation online. But I will be there for compiling questions during this presentation, so as not to interrupt Sarah and Norman when they're going through the slides and the changes into this governance framework from the ICMM. And obviously, after half an hour of a presentation, we'll engage into a much more comprehensive discussion about corporate governance and corporate approach for mining companies of how to tackle these issues of new framework in terms of tailing management, and obviously issues of above the ground and operational risk more generally. So I welcome any questions. We're here obviously as every week to make this moment of your time as enjoyable and sharing as much knowledge as possible. And obviously I'm move better than Sarah and Norman to join me here. Going into the classic moment of the legal notice. So basically, the opinion expressed by today's panelists are their personal views and may not reflect the views of the organizations that they represent. Whenever possible, AMI has verified the accuracy of the information provided by third parties, but does not under any circumstances accept responsibility for any inaccuracies should they remain unverified. It is expected that webinar attendees will use the information provided in this webinar in conjunction with other information and with sound management practices. AMI therefore will not assume responsibility for commercial loss due to business decision made based on the use or non-use of the information provided in today's webinar. I'll just pass quickly on the, maybe people might want to take this QR code. And if not, obviously you can find it on our LinkedIn page. Now I'm back with specifically, obviously the guest. I'm welcoming. I realized I left a lot of people in the waiting room. So now, please let me introduce, without further ado, on this question of ICMM governance framework on tailing management. Let me introduce Sarah and Norman. Therefore, Norman, please first, if you can share your screen specifically. So as I said, we're going to go first into some kind of a more technical presentation of the topic at hand today. And then after, please send your questions on the chat. I'll compile them. After 30 minutes, I will probably orient the conversation and moderate a nice discussion about above the ground risk and operational risks. Therefore, people just joining, just got the introduction. All yours, Norman.
Hey, thanks a lot, Remy. Great Pleasure. To be here. Thanks for the invitation. And yeah, I'm a civil and environmental engineer based here in Santiago, Chile. I've actually been living in Chile for about 15 years. Sarah's joining me as well, Sarah Gordon, and she and I will tag team on this presentation. We appreciate your attention on this because we'll try to walk through it quite quickly, and then we'll open up to whatever questions may arise. So really, really great to be here. Thanks a lot, Remy, and greetings to everybody. Good morning or good afternoon or good evening, wherever you are. Go ahead, Sarah.
Brilliant, yes, so, sorry, are you going on?
No, can you keep going? Yeah. The idea here is to really give a highlight of the tailings situation, really. In terms of hard rock mining, there are tailings of all types around the world, but we're not really talking about leach tailings here. We're talking about tailings that pretty much come from flotation processes. Chile, as you probably, most of you know, is the world's largest current day producer of copper, in the order of 10% of the world's total being produced in Chile. And, copper production today generally develops from large open pit mines with very low concentrations of copper. As you can see here, a picture of a generic open pit mine. And really what happens as that mine progresses, creates a big hole in the ground, obviously. Go ahead, Sarah. And what happens? Well, you know, the tailings themselves are a result of the open pit mining because inevitably the concentrations of the metals are very low. And most of the rock that is called ore becomes tailings. Here are two pictures of generic tailings deposits not identified. The one above is in a dry environment. The one below is in a more humid environment. Then the tailings are fines and coarse materials, and they're deposited, and they have to stay in place forever. Keep going, Sarah. So why do we have the tailings dams? Well, as I said, these are inevitable in hard rock mining because the rock has very low percentages of metals. Today's copper deposits, at least in the Andean region, if they're 1% copper, they're considered great. I mean, I think 100 years ago, people were finding rock on the ground that had maybe 5 to 10% copper in it. The processing of the ore makes the metals, and the tailings come out. They have to be placed permanently in safe locations for the life of the operation and beyond the life of the operation. And they have to be suitable in technically, financially, socially, and environmentally. So these are really permanent legacies of hard rock mining. Go ahead, Sarah. So here's a graphic by Norm Gridley. This really shows a mined ore deposit in the upper left. And that ore deposit is not all ore. So there's obviously a waste rock pile that's created as the ore is mined. Off to the right, it goes into a stockpile before it goes into a processing plant. And today's copper flotation requires water, so there's a water input. And off to the right, the products go to markets. This is extremely simplified. But coming out of that, down below, are tailings. And those tailings are generally transported using water. And they're generally sent into a cyclone, which can separate the coarse on the left and the fine to the right. And then, so the coarse materials can be used to build a tailings wall. And the wall is built to hold the tailings behind it. The fine tailings go off to the right of the cyclone, and they're put into a deposit. And that deposit is generally then fine material that has water in it. The water then is taken out and pumped back and recycled to the plant. And modern day mining, hard rock mining with flotation, is referred to as 100% recycle. What that means is that all the water they can recycle, they do recycle back to the plant or to the process. It doesn't mean all the water, they don't need more water to run it, because they do. Downstream to the left of the tailings basin, you see surface and groundwater monitoring. Again, extremely simplified. There's much more monitoring than surface and groundwater. But the point being that the idea is that the water is contained in the structure and is not sent downstream. On the upper right, on the right side of this, Sarah's grabbed a couple of graphics that show the ways that the walls can be constructed. Okay, as you see, that darker green is the coarse material, and the gray color off to the left is the fine material, and then off to the upper left is the water. And I'm not going to go into detail here, but some of these structures are safer than others. We'll be able to discuss that later if you wish. That's a simplified graphics just to give us a snapshot view of why tailings are generated and how and where they go. Thanks, Sarah.
Thanks, Norm. So as you can see here, tailings, whilst these fantastic diagrams from Norm make it look really simple, they come in many different shapes and sizes, and tailings dams are unique in that you don't just build the dam, you keep building it. And so it's very different from something like a water dam where you generally build that dam and that's it. This is something where you continuously build it. And so what, for example, we find, and Norm will go into this later, is that as our understanding with regards to the best techniques that you can use to construct these tailings dams evolve, we may actually realize that with hindsight, we did something that maybe wasn't that safe at some point in time in the past. And this is important because there are tailings dams all over the world. And many of you may have heard about tailings dams, for those of you who are perhaps new into the world of mining, because there's been huge amounts of disclosures on tailings dams over the last 18 months or so. And that's been primarily driven by the Church of England. And what you can see here is a map of most of the world. Apologies to Patagonia, you seem to have been chopped off this map, with regards to where all of the tailings dams that have been disclosed as part of the Church of England's disclosures, where they are located. And now the reason why we show this is A, to show that geographical dispersion of those particular tailings dams, B, to show you just how many of them are, but C, to say that this is only a fraction of the number of tailings dams that there really are around the world. And the company Terrabotics that you can see in the bottom right-hand corner there, one of the bits of work that they do is they work with the likes of the Church of England to say, okay, here are all the tailings dams, but actually what are we missing? And so, for example, they trawl through all of the satellite imagery to automatically detect where there are other tailings dams that perhaps haven't been captured in this database. So tailings dams come in all kinds of different shapes and sizes. There are different types of tailings dams. They are all over the world. And unfortunately, we still need them for mining. So we can't do without a tailings dam yet in the vast majority of cases where we're mining things like our base metals. Norm, back to you.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, and Sarah's graphic there showed the distribution of these structures around the world. Just to put this in context for Chile, where I live and where some of us live, right? There are over 700 of these in Chile today. Of those, almost 500 are inactive, right? That means they've been built and now they're not being used anymore, and they're still there because, as I said, they're permanent. Of that, 170 are abandoned. That means they don't have owners that are responsible for them today. And there are 104 that are active. And the active ones should at least be the ones that are shown in the Church of England inventory that Sarah just showed us. And there are a couple more that are under construction. This is an ongoing thing. And as we probably all know, the average person on the street doesn't really know much about them. But here we are to talk about them a little more and why they create risk. How are they selected? How are they placed? Just a few points here to make, and there's so many more, but I just want to say that when you need to select a deposit location, and without one, you don't have an active mine, because you can't mine the ore without depositing the tailings today, on today's processes. You need land. You need to consider social and cultural aspects in archaeology. You need to look at environment, biology, biodiversity, forestry. You need to look at precipitation, surface water, groundwater, soils, geology, watershed considerations. Downstream water is always a very large issue with regard to tailings basins. Keep going, Sarah. That's for selecting a location. And the next slide, what about design and operation? What do you have to think about to design this and operate it through the operating life, which can be, for some of our today's mines, might be 20, 30, 40, even 50 years. You have to consider the generation of tailings, the geochemistry of the tailings, how they behave physically, how much water is in them and how much water you can take out before you put them in the ground. Climate change, big factor. Surface and groundwater interaction. The design of the deposit, some of that was shown on the graphic 2 slides back. Operational requirements, closure and post-closure. All these things must be considered in design and operation of tailings. Keep going, Sarah. And so what about the approvals? Well, an approval of a deposit is going to require every time consultation with stakeholders being neighbors, landowners, affected parties, the company itself as a stakeholder, the government agencies, tax collectors. You need to do extensive baseline work to determine if a site is suitable. Then eventually you're going to get into execution, submittal, review, and approval of environmental impact assessments, social environmental impact assessments, social impact assessments. You can obtain permits for water use, water discharges, land use, and you're going to implement monitoring and reporting to the stakeholders and to the regulatory authorities. It's all about transparency here. Keep going. So what are some of the risks? And this is we're going to get into in a moment when also we make a reference to the ICMM guidance that just came out that's referenced for this talk. Some important risks are unanticipated or inadequately managed environmental impacts. It can be related to biodiversity, water, dust, visual, noise. The most extreme cases are those of catastrophic failure. That is to say, the most extreme risk can be related, which has occurred in the world. And these are generally known, the large ones, by the average person. Property damage, injuries, deaths, and many more impacts, including reputational impacts, financial impacts, social impacts, and so on. And inadequate post-closure management or management impacts. The photograph behind this is taken from a very well-known failure in 2019 that occurred with a structure in Brazil and resulted in damages downstream, hundreds and hundreds of kilometers right into the ocean. Sarah, keep going. Those are the risks, but it's not all bad, right? It's not all bad. what are some of the opportunities related to tailings? And this is one of my favorite topic areas, and I only have 3 minutes to mention it. But there is a lot of talk these days about reprocessing of tailings to obtain additional valuable products, byproducts, metals. Now, I want to say part of this is because the old tailings that are in the ground have higher metal concentrations than the newer tailings that are in the ground, because the processing of ore in the past may have left greater concentrations of, say, copper, moly, gold in the tailings than we have today. So you can reprocess. You can use tailings for alternative ends. And this has been experimented with around the world for building materials, road construction, site road construction. This can require regulatory changes as well, because tailings are defined as a mine waste. You can place tailings in abandoned or exhausted open pits, a favorite topic area of mine. I've worked on a project like this, which will be looking at this at a large scale in southern Peru, and which does hold great potential for management of tailings. And you can also place tailings in underground mines. I've had some experience with this personally, also in Patagonia, for recovery of pillars. And so what are we saying? It's not all bad. But I want to go back just for a moment before we keep going here with the reprocessing point, because this often does come up. And in initiatives that are related to tailings management, you will often hear this if you're following the literature and the recent discussions. We have to remember, reprocessing tailings produces the same amount of tailings. So you still need to have a place to put the tailings when you're done. And really to do that means, okay, we can reprocess, we can obtain ore, we can get more metals, we can help pay for reprocessing, and we can manage the tailings better to reduce long-term risk. That's part of the strategy here. So keep going, Sarah. So I'm going to hand it back over to Sarah now, because we want to make mention about a global industry standard that has recently come out, which has a lot of the topics that I've just been mentioning built into it. And I'll hand it over to you, Sarah, for the concluding part of the presentation. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Norm. So as you can see, putting a tailings dam in place isn't just as simple as building a wall of dirt and then flooding it behind with all of the waste stuff that's coming out of your processing plant. It's much, much, much more complicated than that. And as Norm says, there's a huge number of different approvals that you need to seek. Actually, in part, because there have been so many catastrophic failures with regards to these tailings dams in the past. Many of us, of course, as Norm alluded to there, will remember Brumadinho and previous to that, San Marco. Also as well, of course, we have Mount Polley up in Canada as well. So there are many, many different tailings dams disasters that are very much top of mind for many of us within the mining sector. But it's not just the failure of the tailings dams. Tailings dams can also leak as well, which can be catastrophic from an environmental standpoint and also a social standpoint. So tailings dams can go wrong in many ways, despite the fact that we absolutely do need them for most different aspects of mining. And whilst they can provide value going into the future, as Norm mentions, you are probably going to end up with a similar volume of tailings after you've reprocessed that tailings to extract the additional gold or whatever other byproducts you might be able to get from the tailings. So you need to have somewhere to put it. Reprocessing tailings is great, however, because you've already ground up all of that material. You don't need to do any massive use of energy, which of course you so often need when you're smashing up hard rock, which is often the primary mining what it needs to do. So initiated as a result of a number of different tailings dam failures, this particular industry standards began to be written. So the group of incredibly expert and fantastic individuals with deep experience who came together to write this. It was an independent group. They were effectively sponsored or convened by a number of different groups, and you can see their logos on the front of the document there. And this was done in an independent style because, of course, many different stakeholders have something to gain depending on how this particular standard is hiked. But the Global Industry Standard on Tailings Management was launched this month. There was a very good consultation process leading up to the launch of this. But what you can see here is they have split this particular standard into 6 different topic areas that underpin 15 different principles with 77 auditable requirements. Okay, so that sounds fairly horrific from one angle, but trust me, it could have been much more weighty, depending on which way they decided to go. Now with this, what they've done that's really nice is that each of those 6 topic areas are interconnected. So they're all dependent on one another. And this little diagram here is what really underpins the standard as a whole. And so you can see in each of the different blocks that we have the 6 different themes, each of which, of course, link into those 15 principles, etc. So just to walk through these quickly, because it does actually give fantastic insight to the risks that are posed by tailings dams, but also the risks that are posed both on the mining company, but also on the community roundabout. So taking that risk and looking at it from different perspectives, what the group have done here is actually try to bring all of that together in an interconnected and an integrated manner. So the first theme is around affected communities. So it starts with human rights, which is an absolutely fabulous place to start any standard by saying, actually, have you understood who will be impacted by this, either in its normal operation or should it fail? So let's understand the rights of the human beings who are there, and do we engage with those individuals in a meaningful manner, both before you start to build a tailings dam, through the building of it, the operation of it, and into closure. So you're looking at the full life cycle of that tailings facility. The second theme is around creating this integrated knowledge base. So it says, okay, number 1 is human rights. Number 2, underpinning this plus all of the other theme areas, is this need for an integrated knowledge base. And this is basically integrated enterprise-wide risk management. That's effectively what's going on here, because it's pulling together all of those different strands from the technical side, from the social side, the political side, etc., and saying, do we actually understand what is going on here? So can we therefore make the best possible decisions with regards to our tailings facility and how we manage them, etc. The third theme is around the actual design and building, as well as the operation and maintenance of the facility itself. And Norm's fabulous hand-drawn diagram described a little bit earlier on, okay, why do we actually need these? And actually those diagrams that were on the right-hand side of that diagram came from this particular body of work that we're looking at the moment. And so, of course, this says, do you actually design it correctly? Do you build it to specification? Every time you build another one of those walls on top, so you're doing a raise, are you doing that to specification? Are you doing that in line with industry standard, with those engineering standards? Are you monitoring your tailings dam across the entirety of the life cycle, etc.? Are you doing all of those bits and pieces rather than just thinking you build it at the start and then you can just fill it up? So do you do all of the design, construction, etc. properly? Number 4 is around the management and governance. And this is something here where what the standard does is really go into depth on the accountabilities on people and having an engineer record. So who is the person that is responsible for managing that tailings dam? And does the broader organization actually empower that person to be able to do it properly? So I think most mining companies are now, to put it bluntly, scared enough of tailings dams to give those individuals the budget that they need in order to make sure that that tailings dam is safe. Okay? And I say, I think we're scared enough of tailings dams to make sure we allocate that budget. But what this does here is say, do you provide those resources, but also do you have people who know that they are accountable, their career is on the line, because it's their professional signature that goes on this to say, yes, we know that we are managing this tailings dam properly. And that then, of course, filters sideways into things like organizational culture. Do you have the ability to whistleblow if you think something's not being done properly, etc., which from a risk management perspective, obviously is absolutely core to what a lot of us do in that world of risk management. Number 5 is around that emergency response and long-term recovery. So, of course, we don't want anything to go wrong, but should it go wrong, do we actually know how to deal with it? So this is very much one of those reactive controls, but it needs to be there, it needs to be in place. And actually, by making sure that this is in place, we can better learn how to actually make sure our tailings dam doesn't fail, because we can see just how much of a disaster it could be should our particular dam fail. And then finally, into number 6, this is our public disclosure and access to information. So inducing that transparency across the sector. Where does that information get stored? How is it available to the public, of different stakeholders who want to get hold of it? Currently, we don't really know where all our tailings dams are. We really don't know who owns them or who's accountable for them. And so, for example, that's some of the work that company I mentioned earlier on, Terabotics, is doing. So what this does is, this as a standard wraps up not just the engineering component part of tailings dams, which is where so much of the focus had been in the past. It was either on the engineering in one silo, or it was on the social side, maybe with the environmental side coming into there, and with the financial side being separate again. What they've done with this particular standard is wrap it all together, because you cannot look at a tailings dam through those siloed lenses. You have to be able to look at it in its entirety. And that is one of the many things that this particular new industry standard has managed to achieve. So with that, I'm going to hand back to Norm to conclude, and then we'll come back to Remi for some questions.
Thanks a million, Sarah. She's covered a lot of material in a few minutes. That document's publicly available, of course. And the ICMM members, which are some of the major mining companies in the world, are paying close attention to it. It's worth mentioning that the driver for that document, that work, did emerge in part for the failures that Sarah mentioned. I think Lake Poly in Northern Canada was one, but the big ones were Brumadinho and Samarco in Brazil. These events caused so much concern at the industry-wide level that this effort was convened to develop a standard. Which is now going to be followed by implementation guidelines and eventually, as I understand it, auditing requirements as well. But that's to come. That's to come. Yeah, so in summary, and thanks a lot for your attention, because we have gone our 30 minutes and now we can open up to questions. We need these tailings facilities. They're all over the world. The risks can be managed. The opportunities and the threats can be managed by doing the correct site selection, design and operation correctly, closing correctly, post-closure. These risks can be managed, but there's no doubt that these structures have catastrophic risk. There's no doubt about it. Well, it's a general statement here, but it's always true that the approvals take longer than you expect. And we just already talked about the guidance that was just released on this. So, well, we hope in the time we've had available here that we've given you a bit of a snapshot of tailings, why they occur in mining, why we need them, how they can be managed, and what's happening next with tailings. And we're open to any and all questions that you may have. Thanks a million.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Norm. Remi, do we have any questions, sir?
We do. I mean, obviously, Sarah, by the way, I feel I've been working so hard this morning. I've just been listening to you. It was great. You should come every week. I actually enjoy this. More seriously, I think I just wanted to start with an introductory question, which is more or less what Germán also had in mind in terms of questioning, of asking about, enforcement of this. Obviously, those are, this is a framework on management and governance. So it actually includes both, policies at different levels, also corporate policies and standards, and the management processes. So can you explain exactly, those two key areas, the management and the governance, and then obviously, continue by answering the question from Germán, saying, will individual countries have to adopt these standards for actually these to be enforced?
Norm, do you want to go for it?
Yeah, what you were saying, well, first of all, as Sarah mentioned, it's an integrated standard. So it attempts to address all aspects from siting, design, operation, management, social involvement, communication, transparency, all the way through to governance and management. So it's not like one or the other. The standard is meant to incorporate it all sort of together in an integrated way. I think maybe that's only part of the answer. If you want to add, Sarah, maybe I don't understand if there's a concern that, or maybe a question that this is only one or the other, but my understanding of the way it's been written is it's really trying to show that all these things work together, and that without having the management and governance in place, the other parts may be inadequate or maybe never even be seen or tracked. Does that make sense?
Yes, I think just to build on what Norm's saying there, so and to come back to this diagram, I think this is incredibly useful because it does try to show, okay, so where does that management and governance come in? So of course, that's step number 4 that we have here. And as I mentioned, that's got an awful lot around that focus on the technical sign-off with regards to the status of the particular dam, for example, that you have in question. Now we should say that you get big tailings dams, you get little tailings dams, and many mining operations will have numerous tailings facilities, especially some of the bigger mines or the mines that have been around for a long period of time, because you've got this great long life of mine. But you've got, so that therefore generally means you've got an awful lot of tailings that's probably come out of the ground and it has to go somewhere. So with regards to that, the governance is very much in there. In terms of the accountability levels, this is something where the standard doesn't say everything. And don't worry, I'm not going to steal the thunder from one of the other questions, Remi. I'll let you ask it in a second. But with regards to how do you get this standard to stick? Now, I know that some of us have been calling this the ICMM standard. The ICMM, I think we prefer us not to call it the ICMM standard because they're only one of the different parties that came to the table with regards to forming it. So you had the ICMM, you've also got the UN Environment Programme, and of course you've got your Principles for Responsible Investment. So you've got PRI coming to the table as well. And the reason why the ICMM doesn't want this to be called the ICMM standard is because if it was, then you would see that leaning towards large-scale mining rather than actually what does an independent standard need to say. So you've got an independent standard that's here. If you happen to be a member of the ICMM, then it is expected that you would conform or be able to achieve this level of standard. But also, as well as there is guidance to governments or other regulatory bodies, for example, to say, look, this is what we'd expect. This is the minimum level we would expect with regards to those operations or those people who are trying to look after their tailings facilities. Does this group tell governments, you have to enforce this? No, they can't do that. So this is, as far as our understanding is, this is more on the guidance side rather than thou shalt do this, unless, of course, you're a member of some form of organisation where in order to remain being a member, you need to be able to comply with this particular standard.
So just maybe, Sarah, if I want to take it from there, and maybe just after I'll ask you a specific question, which is the question Peter was asking on what does these standards what do they not include, basically, or what is covered just partially, or what is covered particularly well in terms of risks of existing tailing facilities. I just want maybe to bring a comment to the question from Germán on the adoption of these guidelines by countries. So you see, this is a work done by the ICMM, but together with PRI and United Nations Environment Programme. The way it works usually when those large studies are issued with a series of experts is then a series of conversation between the UNEP office and country offices. That's at least what I used to do at UNEP like 10 years ago, and trying to convince the ministries into adopting and promoting those guidelines. Whether there's a binding element to it, obviously, no. We're not yet to those levels of forcing through countries, or at least it has to be transmitted into regulation passed through mining codes and others. But obviously, there's a very strong strength of having regimes that are as clear as those from the ICMM, of being able to label yourself as a sustainable and a responsible mining company by adopting those guidelines, especially in terms of due diligence. I mean, when you have a request from due diligence on above the ground risk of different companies or different actors, as much as we've been asked, for example, on community relations, we've been asked on terms of above the ground risk, also a company that will not be promoting those guidelines or advocating for these or implementing them in terms of the way that they actually manage the tailing will obviously get a negative view from potential investors, especially if those are backed by the national government promoting this. It is very much what you see also with different EITI guidelines or other institutions. Happy actually I could reach out to Mr. Robinson and Paris, I forgot Patrick Robinson if I'm not wrong, from EITI, maybe for a future coffee chat and just try to explain this. Can I I turn to you, Sarah, we got a lot of questions, so maybe let's try to reduce maybe the length of the answers, specifically myself. But on that question, specifically on the areas that are partly well covered or just partially covered in terms of those guidelines asked by Peter, can you maybe give us some insight?
Yeah, so I think there are maybe two areas or two caveats, I guess, with regards to this standard that we need to remember. The first one is, for example, when we're looking at the management and governance, and it talks about, or sorry, more so actually the design, construction, operation and monitoring. So theme number 3, it's not going to tell you how to build a tailings dam. Actually, this is something here where it very clearly states you need to make use of people who know what they're talking about and have the expertise to bring them in at the correct point in time in order to make sure you're doing it properly. So things like the engineer of record, etc. That's a case here where the standard, the level of detail bottoms out by saying, if you are competent, then you will know what we're talking about and get on and do it. Exactly the same as for a lot of the resource reserve reporting codes, for example, in the world of geology. I'm a geologist, so therefore I spend a lot of time in that particular world. It's a case of saying the standard doesn't need to go to that level of detail. Now, that is entirely appropriate, and I believe that is correct. The only problem there is that if somebody thinks they're competent and they're not, there becomes that little variation, for example. So there's an element of making sure that the engineer of record really does actually know what they're doing. But it's not just the engineer who needs to know what they're doing. It's also the people who are understanding the human rights or understanding the environmental aspects with regards to the tailings dam. So they need to be specialists or experienced people in their own rights as well when they are trying to identify, understand, and manage those particular areas of risk. So I think that there is a level of assumed knowledge with regards to the standard, that it doesn't necessarily go to the level of detail in. The second thing, perhaps, with regards to the management and governance side of things is, so who is actually accountable for this? And again, there's a lot of emphasis on the people who are actually trying to manage that dam. Whereas, as we know, actually, it is ultimately it's the board's responsibility to make sure that this is done correctly, because that dam, in the perfect world, we wouldn't have tailings dams because we know that they are hazardous structures that we are building, even though Norm loves them. But there needs to be that high level accountability as well as the technical specialist accountability, I think, there as well. Norm, is there anything else that you would say, or should we pass back to Remi for another question?
Oh, we can go back, but I can say in the standard, it does discuss the structure of the review, the technical review committee for a structure. It does say a good amount about that. It refers, like Sarah said, to the engineer of record, requiring an engineer of record. It requires the expertise, the level of expertise that should be available, but of course, you're totally right, that it depends on what the individual company decides to do in that regard. It's not fully prescriptive, but it does provide some good guidance in that regard. That's pretty much all I can add.
So maybe, Sarah, I'm going to be merciless. Sarah and Norman, I'm going to be merciless here and just, ask you 2 or 3 questions in a row. And obviously feel free to pick the one you feel more comfortable with or you want to address or do it comprehensively. We'll follow up with you and with our guests as we do every week so that make sure that, you get some questions to your answers and reach out to you individually afterwards. Don't worry. Sure. But here are a couple questions, Sarah. Good luck. ICMM represents about 1/3 of global large-scale mining, so 2/3 companies may not follow this. Could lead to mid-tier Chinese and other companies eroding market share of the responsible ICMM miners. What are your thoughts on this? Then there's a question specifically on climate change leading to high amounts of rain in different places, especially in Minas Gerais, in Brazil. What can be done to mitigate this risk, especially for old design spillways on that cases? In terms of Dylan is also asking, could you explain who and how the consequence classification will be determined, as they usually determines whether 1/200 or a 1/10,000 flooding seismic criteria is selected, with large consequences for dam factors of safety and costs. I'll stop here and then I'll go over with Antonio and Tim's question afterwards. Sarah, if you feel more comfortable with one or if you want to address them as a whole, it's all on to you.
Excellent. Thanks for that, Remi. This is now an exercise in memory, isn't it, rather than anything else? So I think so to address your first question with regards to the who is part of the ICMM, and so for example, if that body of mining companies is being held to account with regards to this. But as we know, there are many other mining companies that might be in that larger scale that aren't members of the ICMM. Plus, if you then go into the junior side of the market, there are approximately, what, 2,500 junior mining companies out there. Now, whilst many of them may not be operating, they might be earlier stage. Actually, this is a case where even at exploration stage, you need to be thinking, do I need to look after tailings? And if so, how am I going to be doing it? So that's a case there where, is this the silver bullet? Absolutely not. But does it give us something to shoot for? Yes, it does. So therefore, it actually sets a benchmark that is accessible, it is integrated, and so therefore we can begin to look at it. With regards to companies that might actively not want to adhere to it, it doesn't matter who you are. You don't want to kill lots of people or have a tailings dam failure. It doesn't matter what nationality or where you are in the world. If your tailings dam fails, you will generally be hurting people, destroying the environment, but also stopping production. So you're going to stop making money. So this is a case here where even if you're not a member of the ICMM, so you don't have that to lose, actually, this could provide good guidance to say, how do you make sure that your tailings dams don't fail, for example? Just with regards to your, the third question around who chose the consequence levels. Now, this is this conversation could get incredibly exciting, I think, for many people on the line as we start delving into the world of probability and engineering standards. This was something that was considered very, very heavily. It's a case where when you read the standard, you'll see that they very clearly state that there is a zero tolerance for people being killed with regards to a tailings failure, which is very interesting. Because to take this to a risk perspective, if you truly have zero tolerance for somebody being hurt, then you can't have a tailings dam. And I know that Norm is giggling here. Now, this is a case where the vision can be zero tolerance, but from a risk perspective, you do actually need to be able to bring in those tolerance levels. And that's what you see beginning to come through here. In terms of the more detailed aspect, perfectly happy to take that offline. With regards to the second question you asked, and I will pass this smoothly across to Norman, in terms of climate change, varying levels of precipitation, or perhaps the kind of the frequency of big storms, for example, or something like that. So you're getting a lot of precipitation all at once. And that's a case where actually quite early on, the type of tailings dam, some of them are safer than others, as Norman mentioned. So that was a case of basically people saying, right, we're not going to build that type of tailings dam anymore because it's more likely to fail. Norm, do you want to say anything on that with regards to areas of precipitation, or which tailings dams are safer?
Well, there's some great questions coming up here, it's true. I mean, well, first of all, the climate change question is obviously very relevant, becomes more relevant every year as we go forward. And the standard does make reference to a requirement to review the structures every X years based on any known changes in environmental, biological, social, or shall we say climate-related factors as well. So the question that relates to changes that may be occurring in Brazil or wherever else that influence precipitation events, they need to be considered. And it's quite true that it may require that the owner operator says, yeah, I must make this spillway more robust, or I must redesign the drainage to minimize drainage into my structure. That's probably the most important thing to mention here, that the best siting and the best structures in the world are those that have as minimum drainage coming into them, because the drainage that comes into them is often part of the problem, not the water that the mine is putting into them, but the drainage that comes into them that is not controlled. And certain structure designs are more robust than others, it's true. But the majority of the structures in the world are basically dams that are built with cyclone sands, with tailings. And those tailings, if the structure that manages the water that comes off it is overtopped, then that material is mobile. And that's really part of the technical failure that's occurred in some of the largest failures in the world to date. So the question is relevant, and the climate change factors must be considered. Absolutely. It should be considered in design, construction, and during the life of the operation and for post-closure.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for those insights. Maybe I'm going to go with a second ruffle of questions and see then after if we can actually try to arrive to concluding words. There's some very interesting questions out there. And again, thank you, Sara and Norman for the insight. Antonio is actually asking about the question of, moving away from the whole tailing thing. I mean, I know you mentioned that, as in your introduction, that we have to obviously continue working with existing tailings and others, but what are the different challenges to avoid tailing, and based basically on the BHP, initiative of trying to see how to move away and focus on a zero waste vision in mining. I'd love to get your insight on this, Sarah, maybe. And then there's a few questions. One of them is on transparency and how actually can you publicly disclose, technical data to the communities. I'm more than happy to take that one, by the way. And maybe then a question on the financial incentives and how the ICMM should be promoting tailings in order to get budget increase to provide safe and clean tailing structure. So I kind of misread that question, but it's mentioning financial incentives that exist that the ICMM should be promoting. I don't know who wants to take that one. If you rather have Sarah, the one on the funding, and I turn to Norman on the question of zero tailing and looking at the future and innovation in that area, and then I'll take the one on transparency. Is that okay with you, Sarah?
Perfect. On you go, Remi. Do you want to go with your transparency first?
No, I'll finish with the transparency one. Don't worry.
Okay, so I'll go with money first, shall I? Mm-hmm. So in terms of how do you actually get the investors to invest in the most responsible mining companies is kind of actually really where it sits, and a component part of that obviously are tailings, thanks to the likes of the Church of England, Swedish pension funds, etc. Tailings is something that investors now ask about, whereas a number of years ago, not to be disrespectful at all to investors, perhaps it wasn't necessarily something that was front of mind until those tailings started to, well, it didn't start to fail. Tailings dams, on average, there's basically one big failure every year. And this has happened for a long period of time, but it's just that the money didn't necessarily ask those questions. In terms of how do you get the investors to ask the right questions and therefore invest in the right areas, tailings is just one aspect. I think that the question is broader. I think that we're at a tipping point at the moment with regards to things like ESG, so the environment, social and governance side of those risk-based questions that investors generally ask of those mining companies. The reason why those investors are now more interested in ESG than they were perhaps in the past is because their members, as it were, are now more interested in that. So what you see now with the likes of BlackRock, Orion, etc., all of those investors now ask those questions with regards to sustainability. And one of those key areas will generally be around tailings. And those questions won't just be around how much production might you lose, so how much money might you lose should the tailings dam fail. It's also around the social and the environmental side of things as well, because that all mounts up to reputation. BlackRock does not want to invest in a company where you have the potential for a very large tailings dam failure. Are they getting it right? I'm not going to comment with regards to that. Are those ethical investors getting it right? I think they're getting better at asking the right questions. Are we there yet? No. Does having things like we're adhering to this particular standard help those investors in order to be able to guide them to the right areas? Yes, I think it does. So hopefully that kind of answers your question. Just before I pass sideways to Norm to talk about zero waste and that the BHP initiative that's out at the moment, I think it's absolutely fantastic. But also that many companies have been talking about this for a number of years. So Anglo American, for example, has talked about alternative ways to mine for many, many years. And I'm saying that because both Norman and myself used to work for Anglo American, so full disclosure there. And I guess we sort of saw some of the things behind the scenes. But that's a case where tailings is a massive waste of money and also creates huge risk for the future. If we can mine without actually having to displace huge amounts of rock out the ground, then we've solved a great number of different problems. So whether that's by biological mining, etc., i.e. without big bits of kit going deep underground, for example, and without having to smash up lots of rock. That's the future. Are we there yet? No. But the BHP piece of work that's going on at the moment is absolutely great because it helps to nibble away and helps us to get to that future. I will shut up and I will pass across to Norm.
No, thanks, Sarah. No, we should make reference to the BHP initiative, and we should put the link here. If it isn't here right now, we should put it on there because it's great to follow up on the BHP initiative that's public and is available for anyone to sign on to. Zero waste, well, we could have another coffee chat on zero waste in mining, it's true. Sarah's mentioned the future would be less or zero waste. That is true. The current mining methods today, in which the world currently consumes somewhere in the order of 20 to 22 million tons per year of fine copper, mainly from low-grade deposits that require crushing and grinding and flotation. That's the reality we have today. That doesn't mean the future can't be different. I see another question that just came in that had to do with the management of tailings, dry stacking, filter pressing, and so on. Absolutely true. These things can be done, and they can greatly reduce the risk of the deposit if it make it a completely different type of deposit. It's true. And they can cost an absolute fortune based on what is done today at the scale that the mining is done today. It's not to discount them. There's a zero waste is a part of the discussion around the circular economy. And I believe that any mining company that's now looking at investing anywhere between, shall we say, $500 million to billions in developing a new deposit must be considering how to reduce waste and how to reduce the risk of depositing that waste. Sarah mentioned Anglo-American. Yes, I worked on a project in southern Peru, which some of you on the call here may know about, where the company does plan to place tailings and waste rock in an open pit when that pit is exhausted after 24 years of mining. That's not today, but that's the future of mining. And that pit will be filled up to river level again when they are done. And that will greatly change the risk profile of what is left behind. That you can't call that zero waste, but what you can say is you've taken an open pit, which was shown in my first graphic, and say you've turned that open pit actually into a resource. In my view, that's one way to look at this. Say the open pit, when you're done, is actually a resource. It's a land resource that you can use. And you can put waste materials in that, bring it up to grade, make it safe, and make it even usable for the community. These are things that need to be considered. It is absolutely true. And we should think about how to bring that case more to the fore in the mining industry, because the rate of innovation in large scale mining is relatively slow in terms of getting to the kinds of technologies that Sarah's mentioning, which are being considered and companies are looking at them, but it's not like they're going to be soon. And meanwhile, the demand for copper continues. And as we move into a greener economy where we need more copper, we need more copper. And all mines by design do close. So it means we need to be building new mines. And that's sort of the technical answer. And there's a whole financial story behind it too. But thanks for the opportunity to respond to that. I hope it's a good answer for the questioner.
No, it was good. And I agree with what you said, obviously, but you do see some front runner in terms of integration of new innovations, not only in terms of tailings, but in terms of automation, in terms of human resources protocols, in terms obviously of community relation and transparency. And those are the ones that will in the long run actually are rewarded by investors in the market, because they actually take ahead of the curve, developing risk. And obviously in terms of tailing, it's more than a developing risk. It's basically what has plagued the mining sector for the last few decades, together with the incapacity to reach out to communities and having a series of consulta previa, or so referendums in different jurisdictions in Africa, in the Americas. But if the sector actually understands there's a risk, understand there's a financial cost, and don't get me wrong, but that's called an investment. And that's called an investment to actually get more and better investors in the long run that work and work towards the company. And you have to do this for the sake of the image and the reputation of the mining sector. Now, going into the specific question on transparency from Dylan, if I'm not wrong, Dylan is working with Packed Mines to Market, and we have great relationship with them. I understand the question specifically. I can give some maybe on the future one-on-one conversations, some key example of how you can work on transparency in different jurisdictions. That's obviously something that we tackle and we would look as a priority, especially with COVID-19, the complexities to be able to diffuse correct information to communities, to also the overall population of a jurisdiction. So there are some ways to do so, but you need to have obviously the capacity to be inclusive, to be transparent, and to generate trust and confidence. And that's one of the key elements. We've been, when we advise mining companies, they all agree that the question is, if we go back to scientific data, a lot of the negative words and buzzing against the capacity to generate value through mining in a territory disappears, because the issue is to be able to have these data verified and really housed under some kind of an entity that provides confidence and trust. So we have some clear avenues of how to do this. I don't want to go too much in detail because it's not exactly the topic of this coffee chat. Rest assured that I'm going to dedicate a specific coffee chat to that, a little bit promotional on this. But the idea here is, these by being very transparent on those issues, the mining sector or individual mining companies have much more to gain than to lose. Now, obviously, there are some tendencies sometimes to keep a few things under the coat. There are some diverging voices out there that criticize and sometimes using some images from the 1990s or technology that has nothing to do with the project itself. But that's where there's such a need for investment into transparency at all levels, technical being one. And we're developing a platform from this, others are developing platform for this. But there's really an area where mining companies should focus some of their investment in communication, in terms of transparency, in terms of mitigating risks, and all the complete comprehensive dimensions of the risk. I mean, there's a white paper, I'm sure Andreas is going to be sharing it on the chat, but that's part of the elements, and part of the transparency work that has to be and start with obviously scientific data about tailing management, about tailing governance. And I think that's where the key word is. It's a question of governance. It's a question of showing that having a mining investment in a region, in a jurisdiction, doesn't lead to decrease of government's performance and decrease of transparency. Too often, the mining sector has been associated with corruption, has been associated with a decrease in the quality of institutions and governance. And the idea here is, whether it is through tailing dams management, whether it is with community engagement, whether it is in terms of government relations or exploration practices and how you engage with different communities and with the territory, there is a question of improving governance and showing that the mining sector is actually a vector for improvement of institution and governments. If you understand this, you have much more to gain into the long run than the actual investment and cost in the short run. I understand obviously the financial imperatives, the kind of short run mining of the sector, and forced to be thinking like this. But in the long run, this is a winning bet. Trust me on this. I'm happy to get another coffee chat 5 years from now with the same people, and we'll show you made the right choice. Anyway, I see, and Sarah obviously sent some information, and we're happy to share some more. So we still have just 4 minutes. Can I just turn first to Sarah and maybe to you, Norman, and I'll just wrap it up at 12. Sarah, just you have 1 minute and 30 seconds. Sorry, just go for that.
Thank you very, very much, Remi, and thank you so much for inviting me again to be a part of one of these fantastic coffee chats. I think just in summary from my end, tailings dams, there are lots of them around the world. There are new ones that we're building now. There are ones that we're currently operating, and there are old ones, many of which we may have actually forgotten about. In terms of the risk level for each one of those, obviously they vary, and the management strategy with regards to dealing with them needs to change depending on the context. The new standard that's just come out is a really nice way of attempting to integrate all of those social, environmental, governance, technical, etc. aspects of tailings dams together, which is great. I'm sure there'll be a lot more commentary with regards to this standard over the next little while. But with that, thank you very much from my end. Across to Norm.
Hey, I'll just take a minute. Thanks a lot, Remi. Thanks, Sarah. Great coverage and good questions. And I feel like we didn't answer them all. Didn't have time. But I want to say that...
Again, that's the worst thing. I mean, I can't have Sarah for a third time, so it's just going to be you, Norman.
Oh, I see. Well, I can have her in the background. So what we have here is a situation where we know that mining creates these structures that are needed today. It's true. And the scenario is changing. The risks are understood, better understood than before. But if we don't have those structures today, we can't mine the ore that's in the ground today. And so when I look out my window here in Santiago and I say, look, hundreds of years of copper are in those mountains. We may or may not agree that they should all be taken, all the copper should be taken out. But if the mining industry doesn't change the way it manages tailings in the long run, short and long run, that ore will never be used. And so we may even be pushing the mining off to other countries where we really have less oversight, less transparency, less ability to identify our investments and the quality of those investments. And really to maintain high quality investments that are with companies that are transparent and are communicative and people know the risks and understood, I think we're better off. So I believe that we can do better. And I'm looking forward to the coming years when we do better with this issue. So thanks a million for the chance to talk about it.
Oh, please. I mean, you're part of this community. I mean, the whole idea here of those coffee chats is really to share, knowledge and best practices. Obviously, if anyone is interested in engaging a little further and to, customizing some of this knowledge of those new practices to a specific mining site, a specific jurisdiction, I think, Sara, Norman, and myself are always happy to, have another, 45 minutes of conversation with a mining, professional. We're here to provide expertise and happy to do reach out to us. I think we bombarded you over the last 2 seconds about a series of different links, either from Satarla or from AMI. Feel free to visit those. Obviously, on the last one that I shared, which is the one called in category natural resources and infrastructure, is where we also, it's kind of a blog post format where you will see, find the recording of this coffee chat also, and all these recordings are freely available since early April. So do reach out to us. Satarla is a great partner of AMI, and I think it goes both ways. And we're happy to be of any support to building towards sustainable mining investment in Africa and Latin America to start with, and other places obviously also. Cheers, guys. It was a pleasure to have you with us, and I'm looking forward to next week. And I wish you a very good afternoon, evening, or wherever you are, maybe night. Cheers. Take care.